This week we learned that Canadian forces have been involved in airstrikes against Islamic State since last November. We also learned that Canadian snipers have recently exchanged fire while on the front lines with senior Iraqi officers. This despite it not being a combat mission. Joining us now for more in Montreal, Quebec, retired Colonel George Petrolikas. He's a board member with the CDA Institute and a former strategic advisor to NATO commanders. And in our nation's capital, Roland Paris, founding director of the University of Ottawa's Centre for International Policy Studies. And gentlemen, as I welcome both of you to the broadcast, let me just start by reading an excerpt from Canada CDS, our Chief of Defence Staff, Tom Lawson, who said the following yesterday as it relates to what we're going to talk about tonight. He said, "I understand that there may be some questions about my comments on October 19th about the nature of activities being undertaken by Canada's Special Operation Forces in Iraq. To be clear, the situation on the ground has evolved since I offered those remarks, and we have increased our assistance with respect to targeting airstrikes in direct correlation with an increased threat encountered by the ISF, that's the Iraqi Security Forces. Our Special Operation Forces personnel are not seeking to directly engage the enemy, but we are providing assistance to forces that are in combat. The activities of Canada's Special Operation Forces in Iraq are entirely consistent with the advise and assist mandate given to the Canadian Armed Forces by the government." Let's get into this. Roland Paris, in your view, does this mission still follow, in light of this clarification, its original mandate?
I think that there has been an escalation in this mission, and General Lawson describes it as an evolution. I think it's quite clearly an escalation and a more direct role in the ground war. In fact, according to the information that we have, Canada now seems to be more directly engaged in the ground war in Iraq than even the Americans are. And, you know, we were told before that Canadian troops would not be accompanying Iraqi forces to the front lines, that they would not be engaging in ground combat operations, that they would be involved in training away from the front lines. Those points were made very clearly. So I think it's very hard to say that this is the same mission. To me, this has been an escalation. I think most security experts would say this counts as combat.
George Petrolikas, evolution or escalation in your view?
In fact, neither. I wanted to just a little bit address this whole notion of combat and then get into the escalation. For myself, there's a litmus test before I qualify something as being engaged in combat. So the first is intent, the second intensity, and the third intimacy. And if I can just explain those for a second. So the first is intent. Is there an overarching policy intent? There certainly is not. The orders have been very, very clear that we will not embed with Iraqi units, nor will we accompany Iraqi units into combat, and so far that's not been done. The second thing, from individual intent, was there an intent from this party that went forward to look at the ground? Were they intending to engage in combat? And I think clearly they were not. They were escorting senior Iraqi officers in their advisory role to look at a piece of ground, not just reading off a map. When the incident began, it was all long-range fire. It was mortars and it was machine guns, so it was not direct fire per se. And there was a single sniper, at least from the facts that have been reported to us, that engaged both the mortar and the machine gun to allow that party to withdraw. So the intention was self-defense and the intention was withdrawal. The second thing that ties into intimacy is the numbers. So we have one sniper, not a lot of people, not a section, not a platoon getting involved. And there was not a great volume of fire. There were individual shots fired in order to eliminate the threat, to permit them to withdraw. So, you know, the words that have been used to characterize that encounter as a firefight, and therefore using those words to say it's an escalation, it beggars belief, for my opinion. And
okay,
finally, can I jump in?
Yeah,
sure.
Roland Paris, why don't you jump in, and then I'm going to come back with something else.
I think, you know, We could debate the meaning of combat forever, and as an academic, I'd be happy to talk about it for days. But I think that we just have to apply a common sense standard here. First of all, of course, Canadian forces have the right, should be able to return fire if they're fired upon. But listen, if you send Canadian troops to the front lines, and we were told this week they're spending 20% of their time at or near or right at the front lines. If you send them to the front lines where combat is expected to occur, if those troops are there on the front lines calling in airstrikes, and if they're returning fire even in self-defense in order to kill the people who are shooting at them, I think by any reasonable standard that counts as combat. The more important question is, are we witnessing a kind of a mission creep? And what does this mean for the future of the mission?
Well, I don't want to.
Roland,
I don't want to take.
I find it very.
Yeah,
Roland,
George,
I find it very hard to believe how you can have mission creep with 69 people that have no vehicles, that have no light armored vehicles with them, that have no tanks with them, that have no artillery with them, and are not embedded with Iraqis to somehow portray that as mission creep.
Well, they are with the Iraqis. Obviously, they're traveling with the Iraqis when they're spending 20% of their time near the front line. And the mission creep is in the redefinition of combat. The very explanation that you're providing is in a sense allowing us to change our understanding of what the terms of this mission were. That's the nature of the creep. It happens incrementally and step by step. We need to be very careful about this because, frankly, this war is going to go on for a very long time, and there will be pressure on Canada and other Western countries gradually, incrementally, to move more and more troops into ground combat roles. We do not want to end up in a quagmire in that place.
George, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think we're jumping to conclusions saying that we're going to incrementally add more troops. There's certainly nothing like that on the table. If the government in the next debate that it has on the mission were to say that it was about to send a battalion, I would say that would be a very worthwhile conversation to have, but that's really not what we're facing. With respect to the training that's done on the line, or that 20% of it, the cold hard fact is that's where the Iraqis are. And the training, if we paid attention to the types of training that were being offered, and we can talk about the airstrike guidance in a moment, but it was combat first aid, it was how to move vehicles, how to rescue vehicles from areas, and a planning function. And the planning function has to take place forward to where headquarters now are. Now, where we get into a discussion of exactly where a front line is in an area where these lines are dynamic and feature no man's lands between them are not the images of a World War I front line. So I think we're jumping to conclusions without a whole lot of facts to back them.
Well, let me just try putting this into some context. And actually, Roland Paris, I'll ask you to help me out with this. Canada obviously is not over there alone. We're supposed to be part of an international coalition that's at this. Who else is part of that coalition?
Oh, well, a number of Western countries, France, Britain, the United States, obviously, and we also, and some other Western countries, Australia, and we have partners in the air campaign from some of the Arab countries as well. So it's a fairly diverse group, but there are different countries contributing different elements.
Sure. And what is, I mean, do we have this coalition with all of the disparate elements in it, do we have a single overarching strategy that we are trying to achieve at the moment?
Yeah, in Iraq, in Syria, it's a dog's breakfast, and I don't think there is a strategy, but there is a strategy in Iraq that's being pulled together by the United States. Former General John Allen is the lead now. He's a retired general. He was the commander of NATO forces in Iraq. He previously served in the U.S. Army commander of NATO force in Afghanistan. He previously served with the U.S. Army in Iraq. He's the policy lead for the United States, and they've set out a plan which involves a number of lines of effort, and one of the principal elements of that plan is to train up Iraqi forces to be able to eventually take the fight to ISIS and eject ISIS from Iraq. The critical point being that it needs to be Iraqis that are doing the fighting on the ground. And so that plan is out there, and I think its allies have been consulted on it.
Okay, and George, as to whether we consider whether or not this plan is working, I note yesterday the U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry said about half the IS leaders and thousands of fighters have been killed since the strike started last August. Does that mean, A, our plan is working, and B, we are winning?
I think it's far too early to characterize it in that sense, and my reason for that is the following. Yes, there are the guidelines over an overarching strategy, as Roland said, but here's where part of the evolution comes in. I think people discovered as they got closer to the Iraqi security forces that they were in far greater state of disrepair than we expected them to be. From my understanding, that there are roughly 5,000 Iraqis in the training pipeline right now, and the Americans have assessed that it'll take 2 to 3 Iraqi divisions in order to clear or dislodge ISIS physically from the ground in Iraq. So we're some distance away from that. Now, with respect to air power and the casualties that you mentioned, I'm really not certain how true they are. We haven't seen what those are based on. What we can say at this moment is that air power has managed to hold ISIS in place. There are some limited tactical ups and downs that are occurring, but in the main, they're not able to launch concerted offensives. So in that respect, it's successful so far, but it's very much a work in progress.
Roland, how true do you think it also is? We hear anecdotal evidence from around the world that hundreds of people are from countries all over the world are continuing to pour into the area to join IS and help them with their work. How true do you think that is?
I go on the same reports that you're hearing too, so I don't have any independent way of confirming those reports, but we've seen evidence of individuals doing that, and persistent reports that there are flows, tens, hundreds, perhaps thousands. So this is a larger issue, and it does seem to be a magnet for certain people. Because coming back to the larger strategy for a moment, I mean, one of the major elements of the strategy in Iraq is actually to see reform within the Iraqi state, within the Iraqi government itself, because once the United States left Iraq, the government of Iraq under Maliki ended up becoming entirely dominated by Shia and really excluding and in some places persecuting the Sunnis of Iraq. And the fact that ISIS was able to move so quickly through and establish itself in the Sunni heartland of Iraq, and it's the Sunni areas predominantly that ISIS is occupying, was in part a reflection of the alienation and anger of the Sunni population of Iraq toward the Shia-dominated government of Iraq. So a big part of this large strategy actually involves continuing the reform of the Iraqi government so that the Sunnis themselves don't feel that their government is their enemy.
Okay, let's broaden our perspective even further here. Yes, this is mostly in Iraq and Syria, but it does go beyond that, as these comments, which we're about to play from President Obama of a few months ago, indicate. Roll tape, please.
But I want the American people to understand how this effort will be different from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. It will not involve American combat troops fighting on foreign soil. This counterterrorism campaign will be waged through a steady, relentless effort to take out ISIL wherever they exist using our air power and our support for partners' forces on the ground. This strategy of taking out terrorists who threaten us while supporting partners on the front lines is one that we have successfully pursued in Yemen and Somalia for years.
Well, not so fast, because yesterday we learned that the Prime Minister and the President in Yemen both resigned. The government has fallen apart. And George, I wonder whether or not that says to you that the strategy and the plan is in fact not working. Well,
there are two elements of this. The Yemen and some of the other areas call to the wider movement of al-Qaeda, if you will, and terrorism and the jihadist movement. And I distinguish those a little bit from the Islamic State itself in Iraq and Syria, because I find them to be entirely different from those other groups, whether it be Al-Qaeda in the Peninsula, Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, Al-Qaeda Central. The Islamic State actually controls ground. It functions as a state, and it's a bit of a different type of organization. So when we measure the strategy, it's not just one global strategy against all kinds of jihadi groups or other terrorist groups like Boko Haram in Nigeria, but the specific piece also of ISIS in Iraq and Syria.
Roland, again, to stay current on this, the King of Saudi Arabia has died at the age of 90, King Abdullah. There is a succession process in place right now, and I wonder whether you can update us on to what you think that death, what kind of an impact that may have on all of what we're talking about tonight.
It depends on who succeeds him and what kind of government forms, but all the indications are that Saudi will continue doing what Saudi's been doing, which is waging really a regional struggle against their principal, the country they see as their principal enemy, which is Iran, and also against the kinds of extremism that ISIS represents. And so I would expect Saudi to pretty much continue doing what it's doing. But if I can come back to the clip from Barack Obama that you played, the one thing that Barack Obama gets dead on right in that clip is that we should not be deploying large contingents of ground troops to try and fix these problems ourselves. We've learned very hard lessons about how that can be counterproductive. And George is right. There's no indication that there's going to be massive deployment of ground troops, of Western ground troops into Iraq. But the way these things happen is gradually. And that's why we have to be very, very careful. Although there'll be so many temptations as they're training up these Iraqi forces to say, you know what, they really need our help to do this. They really need our help to do that. This advisors turn into combat advisors, turn into special operations, targeted missions, and it goes gradually from there. We need to remind ourselves of what Obama said about our not fighting these wars. We have a strong interest in training and equipping the Iraqis to fight this war themselves.
I hear what you're saying, Roland, but I also heard the Prime Minister of Canada say that IS represents an existential threat to our way of life. And if that's true, and if they do need help, why shouldn't we?
Oh, because if we end up in with huge numbers of ground forces in Iraq, number one, when the United States had huge numbers of ground forces in Iraq, it didn't reduce the problem of terrorism, it increased the problem of terrorism. Number two, it could very well be a war without end. It's much, much better to try to create the conditions for locals, and by locals I mean Iraqis and also some of the regional countries, to be fighting these problems themselves, as we are now doing in Afghanistan. And let me make one point about training and about front lines. For the last couple of years Canada was in Afghanistan. We were doing training of Afghan National Security Forces, and we were doing that training in training facilities away from the front lines. There is nothing automatic or inevitable about having to move trainers to the front lines. We could be training Peshmerga and Iraqi forces at military bases, as I would point out, the United States is doing.
In which case, George, do you think, since this was a 6-month commitment originally, we should stick to the 6 months, and when time's up, leave?
Well, I'm not in the government's mind. Certainly the current parliamentary resolution has only approved 6 months. And as the generals briefed the other day, they're preparing for both eventualities. On the one hand, also starting the wheels to return home if that's what Parliament decides, but at the same time preparing to stay on. I will say it will be very difficult for us to leave, primarily because our closest allies are involved. Certainly some of our allies have experienced what ISIS-inspired attacks have done, as have we in Ottawa, but certainly Sydney and Paris. So it would be very, very hard to leave with our allies so closely enmeshed and the job, quite frankly, incomplete.
I hear what you're saying, but having said that, you're a military man. You know what's possible. Do you think it's actually possible to, quote, degrade and destroy IS?
Well, at the present time, without a ground force, it's impossible to destroy them. With respect to degrading them, yes, we can, and we've certainly done so, but I would also use Kobani as a metaphor, if you will, for some of the challenges that await. Kobani has been under siege since September. Its imminent fall was prevented. However, the Islamic State still retains a portion of that city and is able somehow to rearm, to feed, to provide water and replacements to what it carries and to what it holds in the city. In other words, its logistics supply line has not been completely disrupted. So it's been degraded. The city has not fallen, but it won't be destroyed easily.
Roland, if we can't win this, namely meaning destroy IS, without additional troops on the ground, should we just stop kidding ourselves and say we can't do it, we're not prepared to do it, that can't be the goal?
Yeah, I think that destroy sets the bar too high, unrealistically high, and I think that it was a mistake for Barack Obama to set that out as explicitly as the objective. I think a reasonable objective is degrade and contain and disrupt so that they pose less of a threat. And I think that is a realistic objective. But consistent with what I was saying before, I think, you know, when it comes to Canada's role, you know, I think that it makes total sense for us to actually increase the number of trainers that we have in Iraq, but at the same time to clarify and tighten the guidelines that we have about Canadians being in frontline positions. On the number of trainers, you know, it's interesting that Australia, with 2/3 the population of Canada, has about 200 special operations forces in Iraq. We have a maximum of 69, so Australia has about 3 times as many as Canada. I think that we should be collectively, ourselves and our partners, investing very heavily in training of these Iraqi forces. In fact, the Iraqi Prime Minister said yesterday on his way to London that you know, that this was one of the things that he was disappointed with. He thought that the support for training more Iraqi troops was moving too slowly. You might expect him to say that. Nevertheless, that would be an appropriate role, I think, for Canada to be playing as we look at a renewal of this mission.
George, if we can't destroy them based on our current commitment, would you be okay with a policy of containment?
Not really, and I think they can be destroyed. And I do want to just maybe dispel a notion of the Afghan or Iraq analogy that it's inevitable that this campaign would flow out the same way. I would remind everyone in Gulf War I that, you know, the Americans put in a 250,000 man force into Kuwait with very, very limited objectives. And the Americans also resisted the mission creep of going into Iraq at that time. So they liberated Kuwait and then they left. And the reconstruction of Kuwait was done through the Gulf Cooperation Council and other factors. So there is proof that, or there are examples where they don't become endless wars. The very existence of the Islamic State is what provides inspiration to foreign fighters that are coming to the Islamic State, but also the returning foreign fighters, as we saw in Paris. In about 72 hours, we might get treated to the grisly spectacle of 2 Japanese being beheaded. A week ago, we saw a 10-year-old child execute two Russians that had been captured by the Islamic State. So in the areas where they have domain, where they have influence right now, what do you think the curriculum of the children of the caliphate is? So the longer that it's permitted to exist, the more difficult, the more strident they will be, and the more problems it will create for us in the long run.
Well, that, in my last minute here, let me put that to Roland Paris, because if in fact we don't destroy, but we only contain, then the ideology which has led to so much misery around the world, including lone wolves on our shores in the city in which you find yourself tonight, that ideology continues, right?
Well, I didn't just say contain. I said contain, and I think I said degrade, disrupt, and reduce the threat that it poses. I don't think we're ever going to destroy an ideology. And we're not going to be able to destroy utterly an organization that is as amorphous and networked as ISIS. But it's true that we do, as a number of the international leaders pointed out yesterday, that we do need to do a better job of countering that ideology. There's something else that we need to be doing. Our international security policy in Canada now is very narrow and very reactive. We react to crises. We dispatch, a six-pack of CF-18s. We are very focused on the military dimensions of that reaction. But the fact is there is a broader problem here of fragile and failed states that, Steve, we've talked about before. And, these states, if they are allowed to fester, can become breeding grounds for radicalism and violence. And the problems of these states are not just security problems. They are security problems, but often they're poor governance and lack of economic opportunity. We could be doing a lot more to address those kinds of problems in countries that have yet to erupt into these kind of crisis situations than we have been to date.
Okay, that's got to be the last word on it tonight. George and Roland, I want to thank you both very much for a good debate on TVO tonight. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.